cowboy didn't ask why the whole town wanted her gone. He only looked at the snow falling on her suitcase and said 5 words that nearly shattered her. Snow slapped hard against the inn windows as Clara threw the woman's suitcase into the street. Somebody near the stove laughed under their breath. The woman bent to grab the handle with bare red hands, but before she could walk back into the storm, boots crunched behind her. A cowboy stopped beside the hitch rail, snow gathering on his shoulders. "I've got a spare room," he said quietly, and the entire street went still. If this story finds you tonight, stay a while and listen. The freight wagon rolled into Red Hollow just before dark, its wheels groaning against frozen ruts buried beneath fresh snow. Wind came hard down from the bitterroots, carrying sharp needles of ice that stung the skin raw. The driver hunched deeper into his buffalo coat and pointed with 2 fingers through the storm. "Town's there," he muttered. "Last stop before the pass closes." Abigail Reed climbed down carefully, boots sinking into snow already halfway to her ankles. Her fingers had gone stiff hours ago. She flexed them once around the worn leather handle of her suitcase before pulling her shawl tighter across her throat. Red Hollow looked smaller than she imagined. A church steeple, a feed store with frost clouding the windows, smoke drifting from chimneys into the blue-black evening, lanterns swaying outside the saloon as laughter spilled briefly into the cold each time the doors opened. The wagon driver handed her a folded paper. "Your recommendation." She nodded. "Thank you." He tipped his hat and snapped the reins. Within seconds, the wagon disappeared into blowing snow, leaving Abigail standing alone in the middle of Main Street with 1 suitcase and nowhere warm enough to go. The Mayfield Inn sat near the center of town, beside the Mercantile. Yellow light glowed through the windows. For one dangerous second, the sight of it almost made her believe she had finally outrun the last year of her life. She pushed through the door. Heat rushed over her face along with the smell of wet wool, whiskey, and beef stew simmering somewhere behind the kitchen wall. Conversations softened. Several men turned to look. Abigail removed her gloves slowly, trying not to notice the silence gathering around her. Behind the counter stood Clara Mayfield, a broad woman with iron gray hair pinned tight against her head. Abigail stepped forward and offered the folded recommendation. "I was told you might have a room." Clara wiped her hands on her apron before taking the paper. At first, her expression stayed neutral. Then something changed. Her eyes narrowed. The room seemed to shrink around Abigail. Clara unfolded the paper fully and stared at the signature at the bottom. "St. Louis! St. Louis!" she said flatly. Nobody moved. Abigail felt every eye in the room settle onto her shoulders. Clara looked up slowly. "Abigail Reed?" The way she said the name made Abigail's stomach tighten. "Yes, Mom." A man near the stove muttered something low to his friend. Another gave a short laugh into his whiskey glass. Clara folded the paper once. "I heard about you." Abigail kept her hands still at her sides. The wind rattled the windows. Clara's voice lifted just enough for the room to hear. "Funny thing about small towns. News gets around quicker than trains." Another laugh. Abigail swallowed carefully. "I'm only asking for a room. You should ask somewhere that welcomes your kind." The words landed harder than the cold outside. Abigail opened her mouth, then closed it again. Clara came around the counter, grabbed the suitcase beside Abigail's boots, and shoved it hard back toward the door. The case hit the threshold and toppled sideways into the snow outside. "You bring scandal into my inn," Clara said. People stopped bringing their families. The room stayed quiet. Not one person spoke for her. Abigail looked at the open doorway where snow blew across her fallen suitcase. Her throat burned, but she would not cry here. Not again. Not in another town, full of strangers waiting to feel better about themselves. She bent to pick up her gloves. That was when she noticed the man outside. Tall, broad shoulders beneath a dark winter coat, dusted white with snow. One gloved hand rested loosely on the reins of a black horse tied near the hitch rail. He had been standing there the whole time, watching, not smiling, not judging, just watching with a stillness that felt different from the others. When Abigail stepped back into the storm, Clara shut the inn door behind her so hard the windows shook. The wind hit like broken glass. Abigail crouched beside the suitcase, brushing snow from the cracked leather straps with shaking fingers. Her hands had gone red from cold. She pulled once at the handle, trying to steady herself before walking blindly toward whatever came next. Boots crunched softly behind her. She straightened fast. The man from outside stopped beside the horse. Up close he looked older than she first thought. Mid-30s maybe. Weathered face, dark stubble along his jaw. Eyes the color of winter smoke beneath the brim of his hat. He looked at her suitcase once, then toward the inn door, understanding everything without asking. The horse shifted impatiently beside him, steam rising from its nostrils. Finally he spoke. "I've got a spare room, that was all. No questions, no pity, no warning about gossip. Just those 5 words drifting white into the frozen air." Abigail stared at him. For a second she forgot how to answer. The storm pushed snow across Main Street in long silver sheets. Somewhere farther down the road, a shutter banged against wood. "You don't know me," she managed quietly. The man reached for the saddle strap. "Name's Wyatt Turner." His voice was low and rough, like someone unused to wasting words. He nodded once toward the dark road leading north out of town. "Storm's getting worse." Abigail looked back at the inn windows glowing warm behind the curtains. Shadows moved inside, people eating supper, laughing, pretending not to watch. Then she looked down at her own hands, gripping the suitcase handle so tightly her knuckles had turned pale beneath the cold. Something inside her threatened to crack open right there in the snow. Not because she was rescued. Because after months of slammed doors and turned backs and careful whispers, someone had finally spoken to her like she was simply a person standing in the cold. Nothing more, nothing less. Wyatt lifted her suitcase before she could protest and secured it behind the saddle. Then he offered his hand to help her mount. Abigail hesitated only a second before placing her frozen fingers into his glove. His grip was steady, warm. She climbed up behind him, careful not to hold too tightly as the horse turned toward the northern road. Out of Red Hollow, neither of them spoke. Behind them, Main Street disappeared slowly beneath falling snow. The road north climbed through dark timber and open stretches of frozen pasture where the wind swept low across the ground like smoke. Abigail sat carefully behind Wyatt Turner, one gloved hand resting against the back edge of the saddle so she would not need to hold on to him unless the horse slipped. The cold deepened the farther they rode now. Then Wyatt lifted a hand to pull his coat tighter against the wind, but otherwise he barely moved. He rode like a man who knew every bend of the trail without needing to see it. After nearly 40 minutes, lights appeared ahead through the trees. Turner Ridge Ranch sat low beneath the shadow of the bitter roots. A barn leaned against the wind beside a fenced horse pen crusted white with snow. Smoke drifted from the chimney of the main house in a thin gray ribbon. Wyatt dismounted first and reached up for her suitcase before she could climb down. A lantern burned beside the porch steps. "Careful," he said quietly. "Wood freezes slick this time of year." Abigail nodded once. Inside, the house smelled of pine smoke, coffee grounds, leather, and something faintly sweet she could not place at first. Dried apples, maybe. The warmth nearly hurt after so many hours in the cold. A boy sat curled at the far end of the table beneath a blanket with a book open in front of him. 9 years old, perhaps, thin shoulders, dark hair falling into his eyes. The boy looked up when the door opened. Wyatt hung his coat by the stove. "Noah, this is Miss Reed." The child studied Abigail for a long second without smiling. Then he nodded once and looked back down at the book. "That all he says?" Abigail asked softly before she could stop herself. Something almost like amusement crossed Wyatt's face. Most days. He took the lantern again and motioned toward a narrow hallway beside the kitchen. Rooms back here. The small room sat just beyond the pantry. A cot stood beneath the window with a thick wool blanket folded neatly across it. There was a wash basin on the dresser and a black iron stove in the corner already laid with kindling. Abigail noticed the details immediately. Fresh water in the pitcher, a clean towel, a pair of worn brown gloves resting beside the basin. Not charity, preparation. Wyatt set her suitcase carefully beside the cot. "Used to belong to my wife," he said, glancing once around the room. "She did sewing in here." The words settled quietly between them. Abigail lowered her eyes. "I can sleep somewhere else if it's difficult. It's just a room." His tone carried no sharpness, only fact. He reached toward the stove and struck a match against his boot heel. Orange light bloomed slowly inside the iron grate. "You'll be warm enough once that catches." Abigail watched his hands while he worked. Rough hands, scared across the knuckles, slow and certain with simple things. When the fire steadied, he stood. "Supper's on the stove if you are hungry." "I'm grateful," she said. Wyatt gave a short nod as though gratitude embarrassed him slightly. Then he left her alone. For a long while, Abigail simply stood there listening to the wind push against the walls. The room felt strange after months of boarding houses and borrowed corners. Too quiet, too careful. She knelt beside her suitcase and opened it slowly. Inside sat her folded dresses, a small leather kit of needles and thread, 3 medicine books wrapped in cloth, and a packet of letters tied with faded ribbon. She touched the letters only briefly before closing the case again. In the kitchen, she found a bowl waiting near the stove. Beef stew gone thick from sitting over low heat. Cornbread wrapped in cloth to keep warm. Noah sat at the table, still pretending to read. Abigail took the chair farthest away so the boy would not feel cornered. For several minutes, only the sounds of spoons and crackling fire filled the room. Then Noah spoke without looking up. "You from St. Louis?" Abigail paused. "Yes. My aunt was from Helena." She waited for more, but he returned quietly to his book. Wyatt came in a few minutes later, carrying an armload of split wood dusted with snow. He stacked it beside the stove and removed his gloves. Noah finally looked toward him. "Storm's getting worse." Wyatt glanced at the dark window. "It'll pass by morning." Abigail noticed something then. Each time Wyatt crossed the kitchen, he checked the stove in her room through the cracked hallway door without mentioning it. Later that night, she lay awake listening to unfamiliar sounds. Wind scraping snow against the siding, horses shifting in the barn, the low groan of wood settling in the cold. Sometime after midnight, she heard coughing. Not ordinary coughing. Sharp, tight, frightened. Abigail sat upright immediately. Another cough echoed through the house, followed by hurried footsteps. She opened her door. Wyatt stood in the hallway, carrying Noah, whose small body shook with every strained breath. The boy's face had gone pale beneath the lantern light. Wyatt looked up fast when he saw her. For the first time since she met him, real fear showed plainly across his face. He can't catch his breath. Abigail crossed the hallway without thinking. "Get water boiling." Wyatt moved instantly. Noah struggled against each breath, fingers gripping hard at Wyatt's shirt front. Abigail knelt beside the boy near the kitchen stove and gently loosened the blanket around his chest. "Easy now," she whispered. "Don't fight the breathing." She opened her medicine satchel and removed a small cloth pouch filled with dried herbs, mint, eucalyptus leaves, wild horehound. Wyatt returned with steaming water. Abigail dropped the herbs inside and covered the bowl briefly with a towel before guiding Noah closer to the rising steam. "That's it," she said softly. Slow breaths. The boy trembled hard. Wyatt crouched beside them helplessly, one hand pressed against the table edge so tightly his knuckles whitened. "How long's he had this?" Abigail asked quietly. "Since last winter." "Doctor see him?" "He came through once." Said cold air makes it worse. Noah coughed again, then slowly, painfully, his breathing began to loosen. Minutes passed, then more. Finally, the terrible tightness eased enough for the boy to lean weakly against Abigail's shoulder. He fell asleep there near dawn, while snow hissed softly against the windows. Wyatt stood across the kitchen, watching them in the low firelight. Neither spoke. Abigail kept one hand lightly against Noah's back while the kettle steamed quietly beside them. And sometime in those silent early hours, something inside that lonely ranch house shifted for the first time in years. Morning came pale and hard over Turner Ridge. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the pasture buried beneath smooth white drifts that glittered beneath the weak winter sun. Frost coated the inside corners of the kitchen windows. Somewhere outside, a horse stamped against frozen ground. Noah slept late beneath two quilts pulled nearly to his chin. Wyatt stood at the stove pouring coffee into thick ceramic mugs darkened from years of use. He slid one quietly across the table toward Abigail. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. He usually wheezes worse after storms. Abigail wrapped both hands around the mug, letting the heat settle into her stiff fingers. Doesn't seem like anyone taught him how to ease it. Wyatt looked down into his coffee for a moment before answering. "My wife knew some things after she passed." His jaw tightened slightly. Didn't always know what helped. The room went still again. Abigail noticed the careful way he spoke about grief, like a man crossing ice that might not hold his weight. Noah wandered into the kitchen an hour later in thick wool socks and Wyatt's old flannel shirt hanging nearly to his knees. He paused when he saw Abigail still sitting there. "You stayed," he said quietly. Something about the words caught her off guard. "I said I would." The boy considered that seriously before climbing into his chair. By afternoon, the ranch had settled into its rhythm. Wyatt repaired fence posts along the north pasture, while Abigail sat near the kitchen window, mending one of Noah's coats where the sleeve had split near the cuff. The house creaked softly around her. For the first time in months, she did not feel the need to keep her boots on. Near dusk, hoofbeats approached from the road. Wyatt glanced up from the porch before opening the door. Deputy Cole Mercer stepped inside, carrying snow across the threshold on his boots. Tall and sharp-faced, he smelled faintly of cold tobacco and horse sweat. His eyes landed on Abigail immediately. "Well," he said, "town talks fast." Wyatt shut the door behind him. "You here for something useful?" Cole removed his gloves slowly. "Post came through from Helena this morning. Letter from St. Louis attached with it." Abigail felt her stomach tighten. The deputy reached into his coat pocket and unfolded a paper. "Seems Miss Reed here left a fair amount of trouble behind." Wyatt said nothing. Cole looked directly at Abigail now. "Merchant named Edwin Price, wealthy family. Big house near Lafayette Square." He paused. "Word is his wife caught him carrying on with one of the servants." The silence that followed seemed louder than the storm had been. Noah looked between them uncertainly. Cole continued. 3 months later, the man put a revolver in his mouth. Abigail lowered her eyes to the stitching in her lap. Outside, wind brushed softly against the side of the house. Wyatt leaned one shoulder against the wall near the stove. "You finished?" Cole frowned slightly. "You ought to know who's living under your roof. That all depends on whether I asked." The deputy studied Wyatt for a long second. Then his gaze returned to Abigail again. Not cruel exactly, just suspicious in the tired way of a man who had seen too many things go wrong in small towns. "You planning on staying long, Miss Reed?" Abigail folded the coat carefully before answering. "I never plan very far ahead." Cole gave a short nod and headed for the door. Before leaving, he looked once more toward Wyatt. "People are talking already." "They usually are." The deputy stepped back into the cold and disappeared down the road. The house stayed quiet after that. Too quiet. That evening, Abigail stood alone beside the sink, washing supper dishes. while Wyatt sharpened a blade near the stove with slow, steady pulls of stone against steel. Finally she spoke. He didn't lie. Wyatt did not stop sharpening the knife. Abigail dried her hands carefully before turning around. Edwin Price cornered me in the pantry after a dinner party. Her voice stayed even, though her fingers tightened slightly around the dish towel. I fought him off. His wife walked in halfway through. The scraping sound of the whetstones slowed. She believed what was easier. Wyatt looked at her then. Not pity, not judgment, just attention. Abigail swallowed once. After he died, people decided I ruined him. The fire cracked softly between them. And did you? Wyatt asked quietly. The question should have hurt. Strangely, it didn't. No, he held her gaze another second before nodding once and returning to the blade in his hands. That was all. No grand speech, no promise. And somehow, the simplicity of it left Abigail more unsettled than anger would have. Late that night, she woke to the sound of hammering outside her room. She reached for her boots and opened the door carefully. Wyatt stood in the hallway, lantern light, repairing the loose hinge on her door with a screwdriver and small iron nails. He looked up briefly. Wind kept pushing it open. Abigail watched him a moment. You could've waited till morning. Would've rattled all night. When he finished, he tested the hinge once with his hand before stepping back. Only then did Abigail notice the fresh stack of split wood beside her stove door. Enough for several days. Wyatt picked up the lantern. You wake early, he said. Figured you'd want dry wood before dawn. He started down the hallway before she could answer. Abigail stood there barefoot against the cold floorboards long after he'd disappeared. The next morning, snow clouds gathered again over the Bitterroots. By afternoon, the sky had darkened enough to turn the pasture nearly blue. Noah had not come in for supper yet. Wyatt glanced once through the kitchen window toward the barn. Boy was supposed to bring the gray colt in before weather turned. Another gust of wind rattled the house hard. Abigail looked toward the empty yard. Something uneasy moved through her chest. Then Wyatt saw it. The small side gate near the lower fence hanging open against the storm. For 1 second, nobody moved. The wind pushed hard across the pasture, carrying loose snow in long white sheets over the ground. Somewhere out beyond the barn came the faint sound of a horse crying out. Wyatt grabbed his coat from the wall. Noah, he shouted once into the dark. No answer. Abigail was already pulling on her boots. He took the gray colt, Wyatt said, voice low and tight now. That fool animal bolts every time weather turns. He reached for the lantern and rifle near the door. Abigail noticed his hands were steady, but only barely. Outside, the storm hit them like ice water. Snow whipped across the ranch yard so thick the fences appeared and disappeared between gusts. Wyatt knelt once near the open gate, lantern swinging in his grip. Tracks, one small set, one horse, heading north toward the ridge. Wyatt stood fast. Stay here. Abigail stared at him as if he had said something unreasonable. You think I'm letting you search that mountain alone? For half a second he looked ready to argue. Then another gust tore across the pasture, and he turned toward the barn instead. They rode out minutes later beneath a sky gone nearly black with storm clouds. Abigail sat astride Wyatt's second horse wrapped in one of his heavier coats, her fingers already numb around the reins. The trail narrowed as they climbed higher into Bitterroot Ridge. Pines bent beneath heavy snow. Wind moaned through the trees in long, hollow sounds that made the whole mountain feel alive. Wyatt called Noah's name again and again into the storm. Nothing answered back. Abigail kept scanning the drifts ahead, eyes burning from snow and cold. Then finally, there, a shape moved near a stand of dead timber uphill from the trail. Wyatt spurred his horse hard. They found Noah crouched beside the gray colt, near a half-collapsed hunting shack buried against the rocks. The boy looked up with frightened eyes, red from cold. Horse slipped, he said, through chattering teeth. Wouldn't stand. Wyatt dropped from the saddle so fast snow burst beneath his boots. He caught Noah against his chest hard enough the boy nearly lost balance. "You don't ever do this again," Wyatt said roughly, voice breaking around the edges. "You hear me?" Noah nodded into his coat. That was when Abigail heard another sound, a low groan from inside the shack. Wyatt heard it too. They exchanged one quick look before moving toward the doorway. Inside smelled of wet wool, blood, and cold ashes. A man lay half-conscious near the wall beneath a torn canvas blanket. Snow covered one shoulder where the roof had partially collapsed inward. His leg bent wrong beneath him. Abigail recognized him immediately. Deputy Cole Mercer. His eyes opened weakly at the lantern light. "Horse through me," he muttered. "Thought I could make town before dark." Then he looked properly at Abigail kneeling beside him, and something complicated crossed his face. Not pride anymore, not suspicion either, just pain and exhaustion. Abigail carefully cut away the fabric near his leg with her small sewing scissors. The bone had not broken through the skin, thank God, but swelling had already begun. "We need heat," she said quietly. Wyatt moved without hesitation, breaking apart old crate boards near the wall for kindling. The fire took slowly. Outside, wind battered the shack hard enough to shake loose dust from the rafters. Abigail wrapped Cole's leg tightly using strips torn from an old blanket, while Noah sat near the fire wrapped in Wyatt's coat, silent and pale. Cole gritted his teeth once as she tightened the splint. "You always this gentle," he managed weakly. "You always this stubborn?" A faint breath of laughter escaped him before pain swallowed it again. Hours passed slowly inside that tiny shack. The storm only worsened. Wyatt fed the fire while Abigail checked Cole's pulse and kept Noah drinking warm water melted from snow over the flames. At some point after midnight, the deputy drifted into uneasy sleep. The shack finally grew quiet except for the storm outside. Wyatt sat near the doorway, sharpening a stick absently with his knife. "You knew who he was the second you saw him," he said. "Yes, and you helped anyway." Abigail stared into the fire. "People still hurt when they're cruel." The knife stopped moving in Wyatt's hand. For a long while, neither spoke. Then quietly, almost as if the storm itself had dragged the words loose from him, Wyatt said, "My wife died 3 winters ago." Abigail looked up. She caught fever after a late snowfall. His eyes stayed on the fire. Doctor couldn't cross the pass in time. The flames shifted gold across the hard lines of his face. "I kept thinking if someone had known what to do." He swallowed once. "Maybe Noah wouldn't have lost her." Abigail said nothing. Words would have made it smaller somehow. Instead, she stood and walked quietly toward Noah, sleeping near the wall. The boy had kicked half the coat away in his sleep. She bent and pulled the wool back carefully around his shoulders. When she straightened again, Wyatt was watching her. Something changed in his face then. Not sudden, not dramatic, just the slow breaking open of a door he had kept shut too long. Outside, snow hammered the mountain until nearly dawn. By first light, the storm had weakened enough to travel. Wyatt and Abigail got Cole onto a horse between them and started back toward Red Hollow with Noah riding ahead beneath Wyatt's heavy hat pulled nearly to his ears. The ride home passed mostly in silence. But it was no longer the same silence they had shared before. When Turner Ridge finally appeared below through the morning fog, Abigail felt something dangerous stir quietly inside her chest. Something warmer than gratitude. They brought Cole inside and settled him near the kitchen stove until the town doctor from Pine Creek could be sent for. Before noon, word had already begun spreading through Red Hollow. The woman they had called Trouble had ridden into the mountain storm and brought Deputy Mercer home alive. But late that evening, after the house had gone still again, Wyatt walked past Abigail's room and stopped. The door stood open. Her suitcase sat on the bed, open, half-packed. Wyatt stood in the hallway holding the lantern low beside his leg while cold air drifted through the cracks around the windows. Abigail looked up from the bed. For a second, neither of them spoke. The suitcase sat open beside her folded dresses and medicine books, the same way it had sat in boarding houses and freight depots and rented rooms all across the territory, ready to leave before trouble settled too deeply. Wyatt's eyes moved once over the packed clothes before returning to her face. "You heading somewhere?" His voice stayed calm. Too calm. Abigail folded another dress carefully before answering. "Snow'll break in a few weeks. Roads south should open again." "That wasn't what I asked." The lantern flame shifted softly between them. She lowered her hands into her lap. "People in town changed their minds today. Doesn't mean they won't change them back tomorrow." Wyatt leaned one shoulder against the doorway. "Cole Mercer told half the saloon you saved his life. That's not the same as belonging somewhere." The words settled heavily into the room. Outside, wind moved through the barn eaves with a long, low whistle. Wyatt looked down once at the floorboards before speaking again. "Noah asked if you were leaving." Something tightened quietly across Abigail's face. "What'd you tell him?" "That I didn't know." She nodded once and closed the suitcase halfway. The sound of the latch nearly broke something in him. But Wyatt Turner had spent most of his life holding words back until they turned quiet inside him. So instead of saying what rose first to his throat, he only stepped away from the doorway. "Supper's on in 10 minutes. Then he disappeared down the hall. The next morning, Red Hollow looked different. Snow still covered the rooftops. Smoke still drifted above the chimneys. But when Abigail walked into the mercantile beside Wyatt, conversations no longer stopped the way they once had. An old ranch wife near the flour barrels pressed a basket of eggs into Abigail's hands. "For the boy," she said awkwardly. "Heard he's doing better." At the feed store, one of the cattlemen, who had canceled Wyatt's hauling contract, tipped his hat instead of turning away. Even Clara Mayfield lowered her eyes when Abigail passed the hotel porch. No apology came. None was expected. Some towns only knew how to be sorry quietly. By evening, the square had begun filling with lanterns for the winter social held every year before Christmas. Pine branches hung outside the church doors. Someone had hauled in barrels to build bonfires near the edge of the square. Fiddle music drifted warm through the freezing air. Abigail almost stayed behind at the ranch. But Noah stood near the stove, buttoning his coat with serious concentration, and finally asked, "You coming?" So she went. Snow fell lightly over Red Hollow that night, soft enough to melt against wool collars and hat brims before settling. Lantern light reflected gold against the white streets. Abigail stood near the edge of the crowd beneath the awning of the barber shop, gloved hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. People nodded to her now, not warmly yet, but honestly. Across the square, Wyatt spoke briefly with Reverend Hale beside the church steps. Then he looked up and saw her standing there alone beneath the lantern light. The fiddle slowed. He crossed the square without hurry. "You hiding from the dancing?" A faint smile touched Abigail's mouth. "I've never been much good at it." "Neither have I." That seemed to settle the matter for him. Wyatt held out his hand. Around them, boots scraped across packed snow, while couples turned slowly beneath strings of lanterns swaying in the wind. Abigail looked at his hand for a long second before placing hers into it. His palm was warm even through the gloves. They moved awkwardly at first. Wyatt was too tall, Abigail too careful. But after a few turns, they found a rhythm simple enough not to think about. Snow drifted quietly through the light around them. Wyatt's hand rested steady at her waist, not possessive, just there. And for the first time since arriving in Red Hollow, Abigail stopped feeling like someone waiting near the door. The song ended. Neither stepped away immediately. The next tune began faster, livelier. Wyatt glanced toward the church road behind the square. "Walk with me." They left the music behind and followed the snowy road past the church fence, where the sounds of the festival softened beneath the wind. The ranch lights glowed faintly in the distance below the ridge. Wyatt stopped there beside the fence line. For a while he only looked toward home. Then finally he spoke. "That room stopped being spare the day you walked into it." Abigail felt the breath leave her chest. No dramatic declaration followed. No practiced speech. Just that quiet sentence hanging white in the cold air between them. She looked down quickly, blinking hard once as snow gathered along her lashes. Wyatt noticed. Of course he noticed. But he pretended not to. Slowly, carefully, he reached for her hand. Abigail let him take it. Behind them, the fiddle music carried softly through the winter dark, while church lanterns flickered gold against the falling snow. And for the first time in years, Abigail Reed did not feel the urge to run. Spring arrived slowly in Montana territory. Snow retreated from the lower pasture first. Then the road south opened. Then grass began pushing stubborn and green through the thawing earth around Turner Ridge. One warm morning, Abigail stepped onto the porch carrying her old suitcase. She stopped. Near the kitchen window, Wyatt had built something new onto the side of the house during the final weeks of winter. A small room with fresh pine boards, 2 wide windows, and shelves lined carefully against the wall. A painted wooden sign hung beside the door. Miss Reed, Remedies and Care Abigail, stood very still. Inside sat a sturdy examination table Wyatt had built by hand. Fresh towels folded neatly beside jars of herbs and medicine bottles, a small black stove warming the room already. Noah ran laughing across the yard, chasing the gray colt through wet spring grass. Wyatt looked up from the fence he was repairing. Their eyes met across the pasture. Abigail glanced down once at the suitcase still hanging loosely from her hand. Then, quietly, almost without realizing it, she set it beside the porch wall and left it there. For most folks, it might not have looked like much. Just an old suitcase, resting beside a weathered porch in the Montana spring. But for Abigail Reed, it was the first time in years she had stopped preparing to disappear. Maybe that's why this story stays with you. Because deep down, most people know what it feels like to stand outside looking in, to walk into a room already bracing for judgment, to keep one hand on the door because life has taught you not to settle too comfortably anywhere. And maybe you know what it means when one person changes that without grand speeches. Just a warm stove before dawn, a repaired door hinge, a horse waiting in the cold so you don't ride alone. Sometimes love doesn't arrive loudly. Sometimes it sounds like boots crossing a wooden floor at midnight to leave more firewood by your door. Wyatt gave Abigail something bigger than rescue. He gave her a place where she no longer had to stay ready to run. And maybe that's the real healing in this world. Not forgetting the hard things. Just finally finding people who make them easier to carry. If this story stayed with you tonight, let me know where you're listening from and what moment touched you most. And if you'd like, come back for the next story. There are still more lonely roads, quiet cowboys, and hearts finding their way home beneath these western skies.